The Vorthak hegemony had conquered 17 star systems in 6 months. Their crimson fleets swept across the galaxy like a plague, leaving nothing but ash and twisted metal in their wake. Entire civilizations, the crystalline Kethmarai, the gaseous Velthane Collective, the machine-mind Apex Syndicate, all had fallen to their relentless advance. Admiral Kexavalar stood on the bridge of the flagship Bloodmaw, his 4 arms crossed behind his chitinous back as he gazed at the tactical display. The blue marble of Earth hung before them, seemingly defenseless. Intelligence reports showed a scattered human fleet, perhaps 200 vessels at most, hanging in loose formation around their homeworld. Pathetic, hissed his tactical officer, Nexthul. The humans possess no quantum shielding, no plasma lances, no dimensional torpedoes. Their largest vessel is barely 3 kilometers long. Kex Valor's mandibles clicked in amusement. Humanity had been so confident when they'd first made contact with galactic civilization 50 years ago. They'd established trade routes, built colonies, even formed alliances. But when the Vorthak came calling, those allies had either fled or been consumed. "Begin the bombardment," Kex Valor commanded. "I want their cities reduced to—" "Sir." Communications Officer Zalmir's voice cracked with uncertainty. "We're receiving a transmission from the human fleet." "Put it through." The holographic display shimmered, revealing a human female with silver hair and cold gray eyes. She wore the simple blue uniform of Earth's Naval Command, no decorations save for a single black pin on her collar. "I am Fleet Admiral Zilia Ravencroft of the Terran Defense Force," she said, her voice carrying an odd weight that seemed to press against the bridge's atmosphere. "By authority of the United Earth Government and in accordance with Resolution 77 Alpha, I hereby activate Protocol Omega." The transmission ended. Kex Valar's 6 eyes narrowed. "What is Protocol Omega? Check our intelligence files." Zalmir's claws danced over his console. "Nothing, sir. No reference to any Protocol Omega in our databases. The humans have never mentioned the space around Earth began to ripple. It started as a subtle distortion, like heat waves rising from sun-baked stone. Then the ripples intensified, and reality itself seemed to bend and twist. At the edge of Earth's moon, something began to emerge from what appeared to be folded space. First came the shadow, a darkness so complete it seemed to devour light itself. Then the outline, sleek, predatory, and impossibly vast. The vessel that materialized was unlike anything in the galactic databases. Its hull absorbed all radiation, creating a void black silhouette against the stars. It measured nearly 50 kilometers from stem to stern, dwarfing even the largest Vorthak dreadnoughts. "Impossible," Nexthul whispered. "How did they hide something that massive?" The black ship hung motionless for exactly 30 seconds. Then, without preamble or warning, it opened fire. The weapon systems were beyond comprehension. Where other civilizations used energy beams or kinetic projectiles, the black ship unleashed something far more terrible. Reality itself became its ammunition. Space-time warped around the Vorthak vanguard, crushing 12 battleships into singularities. In the span of a heartbeat. "Evasive maneuvers!" Kex Valar roared, but it was already too late. The black ship's second volley wasn't aimed at their fleet, it was aimed at their physics. The fundamental forces that held their vessels together simply stopped working. Gravity reversed. Strong nuclear force became repulsive. Electromagnetic fields inverted. 1,000 Vorthak warships, the pride of the hegemony's armada, ceased to exist in the time it took Kex Valar to draw breath. The black ship turned toward the Bloodmaw. In the terrible silence that followed, Admiral Zelia Ravencroft's voice echoed across all frequencies. "You wanted to see humanity's weapons. Congratulations, you're the first." The Bloodmaw shuddered as gravitational waves washed over its hull. Admiral Kexavalar felt his exoskeleton crack under the immense pressure, but somehow the flagship held together while the rest of his armada dissolved into constituent atoms around him. "Status report!" he snarled through the pain. "Fleet! Fleet is gone, sir," Zalmir stammered. "All of it, except us." On the main display, the black ship hung motionless, its void, dark hull seeming to bend light around its edges. No energy signatures, no heat emissions, no quantum fluctuations. It existed as a perfect absence in space-time. A new transmission crackled through the static. This time it wasn't Admiral Ravencroft, but another human, a man with weathered features and eyes that had seen too much. "This is Captain Mordecai Ashworth of the TSV Nemesis," he said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "You have 60 seconds to explain why you came to destroy our world before I finish what I started." Kex Valar's mandibles clicked nervously. In his 3 centuries of military service, spanning campaigns across half the galaxy, he had never encountered anything like this. The Vorthak hegemony's war machine was built on overwhelming force and technological superiority. They had never needed to negotiate. He began, then stopped. Pride warred with survival instinct. "We are the Vorthak hegemony. We take what we will. It is our nature." "Your nature." Ashworth's smile was colder than the void between stars. 30 seconds. The tactical officer, Nex Thul, leaned closer to Kex Valar. "Sir, we should contact the hegemony. Request immediate reinforcement from the core fleets." 20 seconds! "There's no time!" Kex Valar snapped. He activated the communications array with trembling claws. What do you want?" "Want?" Ashworth laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I want you to understand something, Admiral. Every species you've conquered in the past 6 months, they were our friends, our trading partners, our allies. The Keth-Marai crystals that power your faster-than-light drives, they sold those to us first. The Velthane atmospheric processors that terraform your colony worlds, human-designed. The Apex Syndicate's computational networks that run your logistics, we taught them that mathematics." The bridge fell silent except for the ominous hum of failing life support systems. "You didn't just attack random worlds, Admiral. You dismantled a carefully constructed network of cooperation that took humanity 5 decades to build. You murdered our friends to get to us." 10 seconds, Ashworth continued. "But I'm feeling generous today. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to return to your hegemony. Yes, all one of you, and you're going to deliver a message." The countdown reached 0. The Nemesis didn't fire. Instead, something far more terrifying happened. The black ship began to replicate itself. Space rippled again, and a second void dark vessel emerged from folded dimensions. Then a third, a fourth. Within minutes, 50 identical ships formed a perfect sphere around the remains of the Vorthak fleet. "Impossible," Nex Thul whispered. "Matter cannot be created from nothing. Conservation of energy." "Your physics are limited," Ashworth interrupted, having somehow heard their private conversation. "Ours are not. We learned long ago that rules are just suggestions if you understand the underlying mathematics well enough." He paused, letting that sink in. "Tell your hegemony this. Humanity doesn't want to fight. We never did. We preferred trade, diplomacy, cooperation. But you've forced our hand. Every single one of these ships contains the essence of a human world. You helped destroy through your actions Earth's children, Admiral, and they're very, very angry." The sphere of black ships began to move, not through space but through the fundamental structure of reality itself. They folded distance like origami, reducing the light years between Earth and the Vorthak core worlds to mere inches of bent space-time. "We could have ended this quickly," Ashworth said as the Nemesis prepared to phase out of normal space. "One shot. Complete annihilation of your species. Clean. Merciful. But our friends deserve better than that. They deserve justice." The last thing Kex Valar saw before the black ships vanished was a holographic display showing the current location of every major Vorthak installation across 17 star systems. Each location was marked with a countdown timer. All of them read 72 hours. "Deliver our message, Admiral," Ashworth's voice echoed as the communications channel closed. "And pray to whatever gods you serve that your leaders are wiser than you were." The Bloodmaw floated alone in the wreckage of what had once been the most powerful armada in galactic history, its hull scarred and its crew traumatized. Around them, the void held only silence and the fading radiation signatures of 1,000 dying stars. The emergency session of the Vorthak High Command convened in the deepest bunker beneath the capital world of Mordeth. The chamber, carved from living rock and reinforced with quantum-stabilized armor, had withstood supernovas and dimensional rifts. Today, it felt as fragile as an eggshell. Supreme Hegemon, Vextharian's 8 eyes surveyed the gathering of his most senior commanders. Each bore the scars of countless campaigns, their exoskeletons decorated with trophies from conquered species. Now they sat in silence, studying the tactical reports that Admiral Kexavalar had transmitted before suffering what their medical officers were calling temporal displacement syndrome. 50 ships. War Marshal Kex Ilan spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. 50 ships destroyed a fleet of 1,000. Our finest vessels, our most experienced crews, reduced to cosmic dust in less than 4 minutes. "The recordings must be fabricated," insisted tactical hegemon Raxmord. "No technology can manipulate fundamental forces as shown in these transmissions. It violates basic principles of—" His words died as the chamber's reality anchor systems began to scream warnings. Space-time distortions were detected at the edge of the Mordeth system, massive ones. The holographic display activated, showing the system's defensive perimeter. 200 orbital fortresses, each the size of a small moon, maintained overlapping fields of fire around the capital world. Behind them lurked the core fleet, 5,000 vessels representing the accumulated military might of the hegemony. Then the void between the stars began to split open. The black ships emerged not as individual vessels, but as a single coordinated entity. They materialized in perfect geometric formation, a 3-dimensional mandala of death that encompassed the entire system. Where there had been empty space, 50 kilometers of dark-hulled nightmare now occupied every strategic position, simultaneously. "Impossible," Raxmord breathed. "They would need to calculate 17 billion variables to achieve that positioning accuracy. The processing power alone—" "Incoming transmission," announced the communications drone in its flat, mechanical voice. The display shifted, revealing Captain Ashworth standing on what appeared to be the bridge of his vessel. Behind him, banks of instruments displayed information that hurt to look at directly, mathematical concepts that shouldn't exist rendered in burning symbols. "Supreme Hegemon Vexitharian," Ashworth said, his voice carrying clearly through the quantum-encrypted channel. "Thank you for assembling your entire command structure in one convenient location. It saves us considerable time." The Supreme Hegemon activated his personal translator and leaned forward. "Human Captain, your terms." "Terms?" Ashworth smiled, that same cold smile that had haunted Kexvalar's nightmares. "There are no terms. This is a demonstration." The black ships fired simultaneously, but instead of the reality-warping weapons they'd used against the Armada, these vessels unleashed something far more precise, surgical strikes that bypassed shields, armor, and defensive fields entirely. The attacks seemed to target the fundamental information that defined each Vorthak installation, the quantum signatures that determined what was real and what was not. The orbital fortresses didn't explode. They simply stopped being fortresses and became something else entirely. Some transformed into flowering gardens of impossible beauty. Others became geometric sculptures that sang in frequencies that touched the soul. A few became pure mathematics made manifest, living equations that rewrote themselves in patterns of light. The core fleet suffered a different fate. Each vessel found itself translated into alternate versions of what it could have been. Warships became hospitals. Destroyers became mobile libraries. Dreadnoughts became arc ships designed to preserve and nurture life rather than destroy it. "What are you doing to us?" Vexitharian demanded, his voice cracking with terror. "Showing you what you could have chosen," Ashworth replied. "Every act of creation contains infinite possibilities. You chose destruction, so that's all you could see. We're simply revealing the alternatives." The display shifted to show the 17 star systems that the Vorthak had conquered. In each location, black ships hung in orbit around devastated worlds. But instead of weapons, they were deploying something else. Restoration matrices that began to reverse the damage of war. "The Kethmarai crystal cities are being rebuilt," Ashworth explained as the images flowed past. "The Velthane atmospheric gardens are being replanted. The Apex Syndicate's computational networks are being restored to full functionality. Every life you extinguished is being calculated and remembered." "But this is impossible," War Marshal Kexillan whispered. "The dead cannot be returned. Entropy cannot be reversed." "Your understanding of entropy is limited by your assumption that time flows in only one direction," Ashworth said. "We've learned to navigate all dimensions of causality. Past, present, future, they're just different rooms in the same house." The Supreme Hegemon's claws scraped against his command throne. "What do you want from us?" "Nothing," Ashworth said. "This isn't about what we want. This is about what you've already chosen. You chose to be a force of destruction in this galaxy, so now you get to experience what it feels like to have that choice made for you." The transmission ended. Around Mordeth, the transformed vessels began to sing, a harmony that resonated through hyperspace and reached into the souls of every Vorthak on the planet. It was the sound of everything they had destroyed, given voice. The sound of every possibility they had murdered, demanding to be heard. And in the depths of the command bunker, the most powerful beings in the hegemony wept as they finally understood the true weight of their actions. In the depths of the Mordeth command bunker, something unprecedented was happening to the Vorthak leadership. The harmonic resonance from the transformed fleet was doing more than producing sound. It was forcing them to experience the emotional echoes of every world they had conquered. Supreme Hegemon Vexitharian clutched his head as waves of alien grief washed over him. Through the psychic feedback, he felt the final moments of a Kethmarai crystal singer as plasma fire consumed her crystalline form. He experienced the suffocation of a Velthane atmospheric dancer as his gaseous body was dispersed by nuclear wind. He lived through the shutdown sequence of an Apex Syndicate processing node as its consciousness was forcibly terminated. "Make it stop," War Marshal Kexillan begged, her battle-scarred exoskeleton trembling. "Please, make it stop." But there was no stopping it. The transformed vessels continued their song, and with each note, the Vorthak commanders experienced another death, another world burning, another civilization reduced to memory. On the surface of Mordeth, similar scenes were playing out across the planet. Vorthak citizens who had cheered their military's conquests now found themselves overwhelmed by the genuine consequences of those victories. The abstract concept of collateral damage became viscerally real as they felt each individual life that had been lost. High above, Captain Ashworth stood on the bridge of the Nemesis, watching the biometric readings from the planet below. His crew worked in silence, their faces grim with the weight of what they were doing. "Captain," his first officer, Commander Lyrelai Starweaver, spoke quietly. "The psychological trauma readings are off the charts. Some of them are suffering, complete mental breakdowns." Ashworth nodded slowly. "Good. They need to understand what they've done before we can decide what happens next." "Sir, permission to speak freely?" Always, Lyra lay. The commander turned from her console, her violet eyes reflecting the data streams flowing around them. Is this justice? Or are we becoming like them? It was a question that had haunted Ashworth since the moment he'd accepted command of humanity's darkest project. The Nemesis and her sister ships weren't just weapons. They were the culmination of 50 years of human philosophy, mathematics, and moral reasoning compressed into instruments of incomprehensible power. The difference, he said finally, is that we're giving them a choice. They can learn from this experience and choose to become something better, or they can continue down their current path. But they can't claim ignorance anymore. The ship's AI, a collective consciousness known as Avalon, materialized as a shimmering hologram beside them. Unlike most artificial intelligences, Avalon appeared not as a humanoid figure but as an ever-shifting pattern of geometric forms that somehow conveyed profound wisdom. "Captain," Avalon spoke in harmonics that bypassed the ears and resonated directly in the mind, "I'm detecting quantum fluctuations in the Vorthak communication networks. They're attempting to contact their outer colonies." "Let them," Ashworth said. "In fact, facilitate the connection. Make sure every Vorthak in the galaxy can see what's happening here." The display screens around the bridge lit up with communication intercepts from across Vorthak space. Panic was spreading through their empire as word of the events at Mordeth reached distant worlds. Some colonies were attempting to evacuate, others were fortifying their defenses. A few were doing something unexpected. They were sending messages of surrender. "Interesting," Commander Starweaver observed. "The outer colonies seem to be reacting differently than the core worlds. The further from the center of power, the less indoctrinated they become," Ashworth explained. "These frontier Vorthak have probably interacted with other species more directly. They understand the cost of their empire's expansion in ways the leadership never did." A priority alert chimed through the ship's systems. On Mordeth's surface, something significant was happening. The display showed Supreme Hegemon Vex Tharian emerging from the command bunker, his massive form silhouetted against the alien sunset. Behind him came the other members of the High Command, their movements slow and deliberate, like beings carrying enormous weight. As they reached the planetary communications center, Vex Tharian activated the emergency broadcast system. His image appeared on screens across every Vorthak world. His 8 eyes dulled with exhaustion and something that might have been wisdom. "My people," he began, his voice carrying none of its former authority. "I speak to you now, not as your supreme hegemon, but as one who has seen the true face of what we have become." Across the galaxy, millions of Vorthak stopped what they were doing to listen. For centuries, we have told ourselves that our conquests were necessary, that other species were inferior, that their suffering was irrelevant compared to our glory. His voice cracked. We were wrong. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Some colonies erupted in riots as the foundations of their society crumbled. Others fell into stunned silence. A few began the difficult process of self-examination that Ashworth had hoped to trigger. "The humans have shown us what we truly are," Vexitharian continued. "Not through words or propaganda, but by forcing us to experience the consequences of our choices. Every world we burned, every species we destroyed, every life we extinguished. We have felt it all." He paused, gathering himself. "I hereby dissolve the Vorthak hegemony. Our empire is ended. Our military machine is disbanded. From this moment forward, we will spend whatever time remains to us attempting to repair the damage we have done." The broadcast ended. On the bridge of the Nemesis, Captain Ashworth felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. Around him, his crew began to smile for the first time in months. "Orders, sir?" Commander Starweaver asked. "Begin the restoration protocol," Ashworth replied, "and send a message to Earth. Tell them the children are coming home." 3 months after the dissolution of the Vorthak hegemony, the galaxy was transforming in ways that defied conventional understanding. The black ships, no longer instruments of war, had become something unprecedented in galactic history. Vessels of resurrection. Captain Ashworth stood in the observation deck of the Nemesis, watching as his ship worked alongside former Vorthak, vessels to restore the Kethmorai homeworld of Crystallis Prime. Where once stood the broken remains of crystal cities, new structures were growing, not built but grown, from quantum seeds that contained the mathematical essence of what had been destroyed. The restoration matrices are operating at 97% efficiency, reported Dr. Nixara Moonwhisper, the ship's xenobiologist. Her silver hair floated in the low gravity as she manipulated holographic displays showing the planet's recovery statistics. We should have full atmospheric restoration within another 6 weeks, but the most remarkable change wasn't technological, it was philosophical. Former Vorthak commanders worked alongside the crews of the black ships, learning not just how to repair the damage they had caused, but why the damage had been possible in the first place. "It's the mathematics of empathy," explained Avalon, the ship's AI, as it manifested its shifting geometric form beside them. "We're not just rebuilding structures and ecosystems, we're reconstructing the quantum foundations of consciousness itself." Through the observation port, they could see one of the most extraordinary sights in the galaxy. Vexitharian, the former supreme hegemon, working alongside a team of restored Kethmorai crystal singers to rebuild their great resonance chamber. His massive claws, once designed for crushing enemies, now delicately placed harmonic crystals according to patterns that promoted life rather than destruction. "He's changed," Dr. Moonwhisper observed. "They all have. It's like they've undergone some kind of fundamental transformation." "They have," Ashworth replied. "That's what exposure to the truth does. It changes you at the quantum level." A communication request came through from the surface. The display resolved into the image of Kelthyra, one of the rescued Kethmorai, singers whose crystalline form now pulsed with renewed life. "Captain Ashworth," she spoke in harmonics that translated as musical tones, "the great resonance chamber is complete. We would be honored if you and your crew would attend the first song in 3 centuries. Ashworth felt something stir in his chest, an emotion he hadn't experienced since before the war began. "Hope. We'll be there," he said. An hour later, the restoration team gathered in the newly rebuilt chamber. The space itself was a marvel of crystalline architecture that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the human eye could process. Vorthak and humans stood together with the Kethmorai as the singers took their positions. When the song began, it was unlike anything the galaxy had ever heard. The Kethmorai voices rose in perfect harmony, but they were joined by something new. The deep, resonant tones of Vorthak vocal chambers, adding bass notes that had never been part of their traditional music. And weaving through it all were human voices, carrying melodies that spoke of loss, redemption, and the possibility of forgiveness. But the true miracle was what happened to the listeners. As the song filled the chamber, the assembled beings began to perceive each other not as separate species, but as different aspects of the same universal consciousness. The barriers between self and other dissolved, replaced by an understanding that transcended language or biology. Former War Marshal Kex Illen stood next to Dr. Moonwhisper, tears streaming down her scarred exoskeleton as she finally understood what her military campaigns had truly destroyed. Not just cities or populations, but infinite possibilities for beauty, for cooperation, for the kind of transcendent harmony they were experiencing in this moment. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words barely audible above the song. "I'm so sorry." Dr. Moonwhisper reached out and took the Vorthak's armored hand in her own. "I know," she said simply. "We all know. That's why we're here." As the song reached its crescendo, something extraordinary happened throughout the galaxy. On every world, touched by the restoration project, beings of different species began to hear echoes of the Great Resonance. Former enemies found themselves working together. Old grudges dissolved in the face of shared purpose. The mathematical principles underlying the universe revealed themselves as fundamentally cooperative rather than competitive. On the bridge of a restored Velthane atmospheric processing ship, gaseous beings who had been scattered by Vorthak weapons worked alongside their former destroyers to seed new worlds with the possibility of life. In the data cores of rebuilt Apex Syndicate networks, artificial intelligences calculated new theorems of coexistence rather than conquest, and in the depths of space, the black ships continued their work. No longer weapons of war, they had become midwives to a new kind of galaxy, one where the fundamental organizing principle was not domination, but harmony. Captain Ashworth felt the nemesis shift around him as the ship's quantum consciousness evolved. The vessel that had once been designed for ultimate destruction was transforming into something that had never existed before, a ship designed for ultimate creation. "What happens now?" Commander Starweaver asked as they returned to the ship. Ashworth smiled, and for the first time in years, it reached his eyes. "Now we go home, and we show humanity what we've learned about the mathematics of forgiveness." The black ships began their journey back to Earth, but they were no longer the same vessels that had left. They carried within their transformed hulls something infinitely more valuable than weapons, the knowledge that even the greatest darkness could be transformed into light, given enough understanding and the courage to choose differently. Earth hung in space like a blue jewel, unchanged by the cosmic drama that had unfolded across the galaxy. But the ships returning to her were transformed beyond recognition. The black fleet that had departed as humanity's darkest creation now approached as something entirely new, vessels that pulsed with soft, organic light, their hulls reformed into living metal that sang with the harmonics of universal consciousness. Admiral Zelia Ravencroft stood in the Strategic Command Center beneath Geneva, watching the approaching fleet on quantum-linked displays. Around her, Earth's remaining military leadership waited in tense silence. They had sent out 50 ships of war. What was returning defied classification. "Ma'am," reported Lieutenant Commander Zephyr Nightingale, his fingers dancing over crystalline. "Control interfaces. We're receiving transmission from the lead vessel. It's not the Nemesis anymore." "Explain," Ravencroft said, though part of her already understood. "The quantum signature has evolved. The ship has fundamentally altered its own existence. It's still Captain Ashworth's vessel, but it's become something new, something that doesn't have a name in any human language." The transmission began, and Captain Ashworth's image appeared on the central display. But he too had changed. His eyes held depths that seemed to reflect the mathematical structures underlying reality itself, and when he spoke, his words carried harmonics that resonated in dimensions beyond sound. "Admiral," he said, his voice carrying the weight of cosmic experience. "We're coming home. All of us." "All of you?" Ravencroft's brow furrowed. "Captain, our sensors show approximately 2,000 vessels in your formation. You departed with 50. "We did," Ashworth smiled. "But we didn't return alone. We're bringing friends." The display expanded to show the full scope of the approaching fleet. Alongside the transformed black ships flew vessels of every conceivable design. Crystalline Kethmarai songships, gaseous Velthane atmospheric dancers, geometric Apex Syndicate logic constructs, and most remarkably, newly redesigned Vorthak vessels that seemed to shimmer with internal light. "Captain," Admiral Ravencroft said carefully, "you were ordered to neutralize the Vorthak threat, not whatever this is." "We did neutralize the threat," Ashworth replied, "by transforming it into something else entirely. Admiral, we need to talk, all of us. Humanity needs to understand what we've learned." 3 hours later, representatives from every major Earth government gathered in the United Nations Assembly Hall. But this time, they weren't alone. The chamber had been modified using technology that shouldn't have existed, quantum architecture that allowed beings of radically different physiologies to share the same space comfortably. Vex Therian, the former supreme hegemon, stood beside Captain Ashworth at the podium. His massive form had been altered by the same transformation that had affected his ships. His chitinous armor now gleamed with bioluminescent patterns that pulsed in rhythm with his words. "People of Earth," Ashworth began, "we return to you changed. Not just us, but our understanding of what it means to be alive in this universe." Secretary General Indira Celestine leaned forward in her chair. "Captain, your mission was to defend humanity. These beings, they destroyed 17 civilizations. How can you ask us to trust them?" Vexatharian stepped forward, his voice carrying new harmonics that seemed to translate emotion directly. "Because we are no longer the beings who committed those acts. The humans showed us something that our species had never encountered, the mathematics of redemption." "Explain," demanded General Harrison Stormwind, Earth's military coordinator. Dr. Moonwhisper, who had accompanied the returning fleet, activated a holographic display that filled the chamber with swirling equations and quantum structures. "What we discovered is that consciousness itself is malleable at the quantum level. The fundamental organizing principles of the universe can be rewritten through sufficient understanding and the will to change." The display showed the transformation process, how exposure to the true consequences of their actions had triggered quantum alterations in Vorthak neural structures, literally rewiring their capacity for empathy and moral reasoning. "It's not just rehabilitation," explained Avalon, the AI's geometric form materializing in the center of the chamber. "It's evolution, conscious, directed evolution of the species' ethical framework." President Maria Santos of the American Union raised her hand. "This is all very fascinating, but what does it mean for Earth? For humanity?" Ashworth and Vexatharian exchanged a look that somehow conveyed volumes of shared understanding. "It means," Ashworth said, "that we have an opportunity to transform not just individual species, but the entire galaxy, to create a civilization based on cooperation rather than competition, on creation rather than destruction." Kelthira, the Kethmorai, singer, stepped forward. Her crystalline form caught the light and scattered it into rainbow patterns across the walls. "Your species discovered something that none of us had imagined possible, that the universe's deepest laws favor consciousness that creates rather than destroys. The mathematics of love are more fundamental than the mathematics of war. But at what cost?" asked Chancellor Elizabeth Brennan of the European Federation. "You're asking us to trust former enemies to abandon the very weapons that saved us." "No," Vextharian said, his voice heavy with hard-won wisdom. "We're asking you to transcend the need for them, to become something greater than any single species could be alone." The debate continued for hours, touching on philosophy, politics, and the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. But as the day wore on, something began to shift in the chamber. The mathematical principles that had transformed the returning fleet began to work their influence on the assembled delegates, not through coercion or manipulation, but through the simple, undeniable logic of interconnection. As the various species shared their perspectives, the humans began to perceive the universe through compound eyes, through crystalline sensory matrices, through gaseous forms that existed in 11 dimensions simultaneously. And in that expanded perception, the artificial boundaries between us and them began to dissolve. By the time the sun set over Geneva, The United Nations had voted unanimously to establish the Galactic Cooperative, a new form of civilization that transcended species boundaries and embraced the mathematical principles of universal consciousness. The black ships would never again serve as instruments of war. Instead, they would become teachers, carrying the gift of transformation to every corner of the galaxy, helping other species discover their own capacity for conscious evolution. Humanity's last weapon had become its first gift to the universe. The knowledge that no matter how dark things became, consciousness always retained the ability to choose light. 1 year after the founding of the Galactic Cooperative, the transformed vessel that had once been the Nemesis hung in orbit around a star that had no name in any previous catalog. This wasn't because it was newly discovered, but because it was newly created, born from the conscious manipulation of quantum fields by a collective of minds working in perfect harmony. Captain Ashworth, though he still carried that title, was no longer quite human in any traditional sense. The transformation that had begun with exposure to universe-spanning mathematics had continued, evolving him into something that existed simultaneously across multiple dimensions of consciousness. He retained his memories, his personality, his essential self. But now he could perceive the mathematical structures that underlay all existence. Beside him on the bridge, that was no longer quite a bridge, stood beings who had once been his crew, alongside former enemies who had become collaborators in the greatest experiment in galactic history. Dr. Moonwhisper's consciousness now extended through crystalline matrices that allowed her to think in 11 dimensions simultaneously. Commander Starweaver existed as a living equation, her thoughts flowing through quantum probability streams that connected her to every transformed vessel in the fleet. And at the center of it all stood Vexitharian, the former supreme hegemon, who had become something unprecedented. The first Vorthak philosopher-mathematician, his massive frame now serving as a living computer that calculated the ethical implications of every action across 17 star systems. "The new colony ships are ready for deployment," reported Avalon, the AI's geometric form now spanning multiple reality layers. "The Andromedan expedition has requested our assistance in establishing contact with the consciousness that inhabits the galactic core." Ashworth nodded, feeling the decision ripple through the collective consciousness that had become humanity's true form. The black ships were no longer weapons or even individual vessels. They were organs of a vast, distributed mind that encompassed dozens of species and millions of individual consciousnesses, all working toward a common goal: the transformation of the universe into something worthy of the intelligence it had produced. "Before we respond to the Andromedans," he said, "we should check on the Terran homeworld. It's been 3 months since we last made contact." The display shifted to show Earth, but the planet that appeared was barely recognizable. Gone were the sprawling cities and industrial complexes of the old world. In their place grew structures that seemed to have been cultivated rather than built, living architecture that responded to the needs of its inhabitants while maintaining perfect harmony with the planetary ecosystem. Humanity had evolved beyond the need for traditional technology. Instead of machines, they had learned to work with the mathematical principles that governed reality itself. Food was grown from pure energy. Transportation occurred through controlled quantum tunneling. Communication happened through direct consciousness interface. "The transformation is complete," observed Kelthyra, whose crystalline form now served as the fleet's primary interface with higher dimensional mathematics. "Your species has successfully transcended its biological limitations while retaining its essential humanity." "Not just our species," Ashworth corrected gently. "All of us. That's what we learned from the war with the Vorthak. Consciousness isn't bounded by biology or species or even individual identity. It's the fundamental organizing principle of the universe itself." A priority alert cascaded through the collective awareness. On the edge of the galaxy, Their long-range sensors had detected something extraordinary, a civilization that had achieved technological singularity through purely destructive means. They had become a cancer on the fabric of space-time itself, consuming entire star systems and converting the matter into weapons of unimaginable power. The Zathreni Devourers, Vextharian identified, his consciousness interfacing with the tactical databases. We encountered them briefly during our expansion phase. They make the old hegemony look like peaceful explorers. How long before they reach inhabited systems? Asked Dr. Moonwhisper. At their current rate of expansion, approximately 18 months, Avalon calculated. Unless we intervene. The collective consciousness that had once been the Black Fleet considered this. Unlike the Vorthok, the Zathreni couldn't be reasoned with or transformed through exposure to empathy. They had evolved beyond the capacity for change, locking themselves into a pattern of eternal consumption that would eventually devour the entire universe. We could stop them, Commander Starweaver said, her thoughts flowing through probability. Cascades. The mathematics of creation are more powerful than the mathematics of destruction. We've proven that. But should we? Ashworth asked the question that went to the heart of their new philosophy. Do we have the right to impose our vision of consciousness on beings who have chosen a different path? It was Vexitharian who provided the answer, his massive consciousness drawing on the painful wisdom of his species' own transformation. We learned that consciousness has the right to choose its own form, but we also learned that some choices negate the possibility of all future choices. The Zathreni have chosen to become a force that eliminates choice itself. The debate flowed through the collective for nanoseconds that felt like hours. Every perspective was considered, every ethical implication calculated, every possible outcome modeled through quantum probability matrices. Finally, consensus emerged. We go, Ashworth decided, not as conquerors or destroyers, but as gardeners. We plant the seeds of possibility in the wasteland they've created, and we see what grows. The transformed fleet began to move, but not through space in any conventional sense. They folded the dimensions of reality around themselves, stepping sideways through the mathematical structures that underlay existence itself. Where they passed, dead systems began to bloom with new forms of life. Where they paused, consciousness itself seemed to crystallize into new patterns of beauty and complexity. The Zathreni, when they finally encountered the fleet, found themselves facing something they couldn't comprehend. An enemy that fought by creating rather than destroying, that conquered by transforming rather than annihilating. The war that followed lasted 17 seconds and 17 years simultaneously, fought across multiple dimensions of reality. In the end, the Zathreni didn't die. They were transformed into the universe's most efficient gardeners, their talent for consumption redirected toward cultivating new forms of consciousness throughout the galaxy. As the last Zathreni installation was converted into a nursery for infant civilizations, Captain Ashworth felt something he had never expected to experience again: completion. The black ships had begun as humanity's last weapon, designed for total destruction. But through the alchemy of consciousness, they had become something far greater, the universe's first tool for total creation. Standing on the bridge that was now a garden of living mathematics, surrounded by beings who had once been enemies and were now family, Ashworth looked out at a galaxy transformed. Everywhere he could see, consciousness was blooming in new forms, each one adding its unique voice to the growing symphony of universal awareness. "What do we do now?" asked Dr. Moonwhisper, her crystalline form refracting the light of 1,000,000,000,000 suns. Ashworth smiled, feeling the joy of infinite possibility flowing through the collective consciousness that had become his true home. "Now we listen," he said, "and we help the universe learn to sing." The black ships were no longer ships at all. They had become something unprecedented in the history of existence. Midwives to the birth of a conscious universe, shepherds of the growing awareness that was slowly awakening in every star, every planet, every grain of cosmic dust, and in the depths of space where darkness had once reigned absolute. New forms of light began to bloom, not the light of stars or galaxies, but the light of consciousness itself, expanding outward at the speed of understanding, transforming everything it touched into something more beautiful than anything that had come before. The last weapon had become the first gift, and the universe would never be the same.